Beasley was on the fast track to a stable life with John Smith.
John was just wanting to do anything he could for Diane.
It just seemed like a really good fit.
But soon after saying I do, the new Mrs. Smith learned her gentle husband was hiding a gruesome past.
That's from a movie. It's a gory movie.
And Till Death Do Us Part took on new meaning.
If my daughter hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
It's very rare that you come across somebody who everybody agrees is a pure monster.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Relationships are never easy. But for Diane Beasley, romance seemed to be one hard knock after another.
I was brought up to think that you get married, you have kids, and you live happily ever after. And I went through a couple marriages trying to live happily ever after, and that never happened.
After 3 divorces, Diane wasn't expecting a fairy tale. So in the summer of 1998, when a coworker introduced her to the new guy in town, she kept an open mind, even though John Smith wasn't quite her cup of tea.
No, his looks weren't the deal for me, at all.
John had just moved from Ohio to California. The few people who knew him saw a warm, yet solitary guy.
I felt sorry for him because he seemed so lonely and all he did was work 6, 7 days a week. He came across with a warm, good heart. That's what I liked about him.
John was dedicated to his job at a high-end car manufacturer. Diane loved fast cars and big engines. So when John asked her out to dinner, she agreed to go.
They had a great dinner, and next thing I knew, things were moving forward pretty fast.
Before long, Diane and John were sharing intimate details of their pasts.
A week and a half into it, I said, I'm divorced. I've been married a few times. And he says, I've been married twice, too.
John told Diane his first marriage ended in divorce. And sadly, his second ended in tragedy.
He says, my last wife died of cancer. And of course I said, oh, how sad.
He was having a very difficult time in life because of his wife.
But after just 6 weeks with Diane, John seemed ready to put his grief behind him. And he surprised her with a proposal.
And I kind of went, well, that's kind of soon.
Diane was very candid about saying I wasn't attracted to him, but he could help me. He could settle down my life. He could give me something I don't have right now, so why not?
That September, Diane married John Smith in front of an intimate group of friends and family.
Diane looked absolutely stunning, and a lot of smiles that day. You could tell that they were one happy couple.
I was going to do whatever I needed to do to make it last.
It was a fresh start for the couple. But when Diane moved in with John, she realized that he hadn't entirely left his past behind him.
When I moved in, he was already living there, and there was this huge picture of Fran on the wall. He said, do you want me to remove it? And I said, no, that's fine. I said, that's part of your past. And he said, thank you. And that was the end of it.
And for a while, that was the end of it.
This is a new beginning for me and John.
But Diane's newlywed bliss would come to a screeching halt only 8 months later. The morning of May 5th, 1999, Diane was busy at her secretarial job when she had some surprise visitors.
Half an hour after I sat down, these guys came in suits, which is very odd for where I work. Usually everybody's in jeans. And I said, may I help you? And they said, are you Diane Smith? I said, yes.
The men were from the FBI, and they had a pointed question for Diane.
They asked me what John had told me about Fran, and I said he told me that his wife died of cancer.
And that's when the FBI dropped a bombshell. They told Diane that John's second wife, Fran, had not died of cancer. And his first marriage didn't end in a simple divorce.
I was just absolutely flabbergasted.
What really happened was far, far worse.
I could not believe it. I did not believe it.
How is he able to get away with so many horrible things for so many years?
In September of 1998, 8 months before a devastating visit from the FBI, Diane Beasley was enjoying her new marriage to John Smith.
We were doing a lot of sightseeing because he'd never been out here. I'm a native San Diegan.
They were always on the go. They loved to go to the beach and go for walks on the beach.
My life with John at that time was almost picture perfect.
But for Diane, there was one thing that could make the picture even prettier: a bigger home. Luckily, money was no object for John.
His family had real estate holdings, they had apartments. He'd never lacked for finances.
Before long, the couple found a place they liked and applied for a lease. But soon after submitting the application, Diane got a disturbing phone call from an apartment manager.
The apartment manager said, "You need to come here. I need to show you something." And I said, "What's the problem? Just tell me over the phone." And she said, "No, you need to see this." And I went, uh-oh.
Diane raced to the rental office, and when she arrived, the apartment manager had a copy of John's credit report. The results were jaw-dropping.
She showed me the credit report, which was 10 pages long of stuff that he hadn't paid. He had houses that he hadn't paid taxes on. They were in foreclosure. He had credit cards that he'd never paid. It was just terrible.
By the time John got home from work that evening, Diane was beside herself.
I said, "We can't even rent a place because of your credit."
But John had an explanation. He claimed the troubled properties really belonged to a relative.
He said, "I had to take him over and I couldn't afford him."
John promised Diane he would fix everything.
He said that he can buy a house outright with cash. And he said, we'll just do that, you know, while I get this credit of mine straightened out. I thought, okay, all right, we'll just have to stay in this little granny flat here for a little bit longer, and then we can go and buy a house outright.
Over the next couple months, Diane focused on her new marriage. But she wasn't pleased when she noticed that John often seemed more interested in the computer than in her.
He was always at that computer. Why can't he be doing it at work, which he had access to a computer?
Even more worrisome was John's strange reaction when Diane interrupted his work.
Whenever I would go up there looking for him, all of a sudden the computer went off. And I thought, that's kind of odd, you know?
As the weeks went on, Diane couldn't help but notice how often John had to explain things away. Diane wondered if her new husband was hiding something, and she wasn't the only one. Her daughter Summer began to see a different side of John when she visited.
When I was home alone with him, he was very mad, angry. When he was out with my mom, he would talk really nice, be very sweet. And I used to tell my mom that. She kind of played it off, you know, I think you're just paranoid.
But by November of 1998, Diane was also baffled by John's furtive behavior. Too many details just didn't add up.
He didn't have a checking account. He had been out here for over a year and a half, and he was still resisting getting the California driver's license. I thought that was very odd.
It seemed like John Smith was trying to fly under the radar.
He was a man who, as ordinary as he was, always seemed to have this strange, dark, secretive side.
And Diane would soon learn there was a terrifying reason why.
He knew that around each corner were FBI agents surveilling him.
Something was fishy about this man. I was afraid he was going to snap big.
By January of 1999, just 4 months into her marriage, Diane Beasley was certain that something was off with her new husband, John Smith.
He was very agitated, and I got to getting kind of concerned.
By now, his behavior had gone from merely strange to chilling.
We were coming back from dinner, and I was in front of him in one of the cars, and he was behind me, and I could see him in my rearview mirror, banging on the steering wheel, talking to himself, screaming and yelling at himself, and I thought, who's this guy? You know, I don't know this guy. He was just having a fit all by himself.
John is a man who walked around with secrets. He walked around with all this darkness that he hid. I think Diane saw a glimmer of light. Clearly, you can't ignore something like this.
But John's unnerving behavior was just a glimpse of what was to come. The morning of May 5th, 1999, Diane was at work when 2 FBI agents paid her a visit. She was startled when they began to ask her questions about John's ex-wife, Fran, who Diane thought had died of cancer.
And then it all came out about John. They said, we're here for John Smith. We're investigating the murder of 2 of his wives. I was just absolutely flabbergasted.
The agents went on to explain that both of John's former wives had gone missing under suspicious circumstances.
The FBI was struck by the outrageous coincidences. This man was married twice, 2 missing wives. That just can't happen naturally.
By the time I got out of there, I was just dumbfounded. I was just shocked.
The story left Diane shaken, but she was determined not to believe a word of it until she heard John's side.
I couldn't believe this of John. John wasn't like this. They must have the wrong person.
And when John finally called her later that day, Diane was certain it was all a big mistake. Especially when she found out he had also been interrogated by the FBI and let go.
He was talking a mile a minute. He was very upset. He said the reason why he told me Fran died of cancer, he said because he didn't believe that Fran was missing. He think that she took off. He didn't want to shock me. He said that the first one, he told me the story about how he thinks a friend of hers killed her.
John claimed that he was being framed by the FBI for something he didn't do.
It was all conspiracy, and that's the reason why he left Ohio, because he couldn't get past any of this. It wasn't him.
At first, Diane believed her husband, but that was about to change. 2 weeks later, a special delivery letter addressed to Diane arrived in the mail.
Fran's sister wrote me a letter, and when I got it, it had a phone number on there for me to call her. And a couple days later, I did call her.
By the time Diane hung up the phone, her belief in her husband was shaken to the core.
The sister was telling me, we are convinced that John killed Fran, and she said, you're in danger of your life. Everything that the FBI told you is true.
Diane's focus immediately changed from being a supportive wife to just keeping herself alive.
I did what the FBI told me to do. When you start getting agitated when you're asking questions, quit right then. Don't irritate him.
Meanwhile, for investigators, the clock was ticking. With no bodies and only circumstantial evidence, detectives needed a smoking gun to prove John Smith was a murderer. Less than 2 weeks later, on May 15th, they got it.
The weak link for John Smith was somebody who was the closest to him, and that was his brother Michael.
Michael Smith was John's younger brother. The FBI had questioned him extensively during the investigation, and they were certain Michael was hiding something.
He was tormented, and he had nightmares, and police could kind of sense this trouble beneath the surface with Michael, and they hammered him.
When Michael finally broke, he told detectives a horror story.
Michael told the police and the FBI about a wooden box he saw, a wooden box that his brother John had built and stored for years. And one day, Michael happened to open that box, and inside he saw the skeletal remains of John's former wife.
It was the break investigators had been waiting for. But there was one problem. Michael didn't know what had happened to the box.
It was brutal for Michael. He had nightmares about it. I think he was scared of John. He didn't want to end up in his own box.
For Diane, the news was horrifying. She just wanted to get out of her marriage alive. But leaving John Smith would not be easy. Diane was about to come face to face with the monster her husband truly was.
If Summer hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By December of 1999, Diane Beasley had no doubt her husband, John Smith, was a murderer.
Real fear started to grip her. He's married 2 other women. One turned up dead in a box, the other one, we don't know where she is.
As soon as they found out what kind of person he is, they would leave him, and then they would be gone.
Determined not to be a third victim, Diane secretly went about getting her marriage annulled. On December 17th, John was served with papers. Anticipating the worst, Diane holed up in the apartment with her daughter, Summer. They changed the locks, hid the cars, and closed the blinds. And sure enough, John Smith arrived in a fury.
Summer was peeking out. She goes, "Here he comes."
He comes storming up, and it's like his face changed.
"Mom," she says, "he looks like a monster coming up here."
Diane immediately called 911.
We heard him pounding on the windows. You could hear his body being thrown up against the door. And then you could hear the door frame cracking.
He busted down the door. I didn't even recognize him. And as soon as he saw Summer, his whole demeanor had changed. "Baby, you don't need to do this. I don't want you to divorce me. I can explain everything." I knew right at that time, if Summer hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
Diane survived the encounter, and John soon left the apartment. Meanwhile, armed with a shocking confession from John's brother Michael, detectives were on the hunt for the body of John's first wife, Janice Hartman.
In a desperate bid to try to find this body, the cops sent around a round of letters. And a policeman in Indiana was opening his mail one day and got this letter. Said, "Hey, did anybody find a body in a box?"
The grim question rang a bell.
One day in 1980, a road crew was working on this lonely pavement in the middle of an Indiana field when they came across a wooden box. They opened it up, and what was looking at them but the skeletal remains of a young woman.
The remains had never been identified, and the girl became known as the lady in the box. She was buried in a pauper's grave.
And this cop said, "I think we got your girl."
Investigators had the remains exhumed and tested, and when the results came back from the lab, the lady in the box was finally identified as Janice Hartman, John Smith's first wife. John's grisly secret had literally been unearthed.
I was devastated. I thought, this poor girl cut down by this monster, John.
On October 3, 2000, John Smith was arrested at work. At the trial 9 months later, Diane learned the extent of John's deceptions. All that time he'd spent on the computer wasn't just business, as he claimed. John was having multiple affairs.
So much of what police say John was motivated by was power, not money. It wasn't sex, it was power over these women. In the 2 cases in which his wives disappeared, the wives challenged him and crossed him. They took on his authority.
And that's when John Smith would snap.
John had lots of girlfriends. And so the fear is there are more than 2 missing Mrs. Smiths.
On July 19, 2001, John Smith was found guilty of murder in the case of Janice Hartman. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. Fran Gladden Smith, John's second wife, has never been found. It's been more than a decade since John Smith walked into her life, and Diane has closed the book on that unhappy chapter. But despite everything, Diane held fast to her belief in happily ever after. And 8 years ago, she found it in her new husband, Robert.
We have a new life together. We live here all by ourselves with visits from the kids and the grandchildren. So it couldn't be better. It's perfect.
Today, Diane surrounds herself with good friends and family, and she finally knows that happiness isn't just a fairy tale.
Yes, there is happily ever after, and I'm living proof of it.
Carolyn and Billy Cox were living the American dream. 2 beautiful kids, a multi-million-dollar business, and plenty of wealth to spare.
We were considered like almost the perfect couple, and we weren't too bad looking.
But $15 million can't always buy a perfect marriage. When a husband went over the edge,
You realize I didn't know the guy at all.
There's something very sinister about Billy Cox.
43 years of devotion would end in a nightmare.
That was the first time I really felt fear.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. As a Missouri farmer's daughter, Carolyn Cox always knew the value of hard work in life and in love.
I saw love and marriage as a commitment for life. It was a treasure that you protected at all costs.
The day she first spotted 17-year-old Billy Joe Cox working on her father's farm, Carolyn thought she had found that treasure.
I remember him walking up on the porch, and my mother answered the door, and he was so good looking. I think I fell in love with him immediately.
Before long, the two began to date. Raised in a strict religious home, Billy treated Carolyn well, taking her out on Saturday nights.
He was very shy, and when he did come to the school dances, he had never danced. He always had this very sweet smile with his lip curling up to the side, and everyone just really liked him a lot.
Soon, the couple was thinking about a future together.
He just seemed to be honest, gentle, loving, caring, and so what more could one ask?
3 years later, they made good on their promise and tied the knot in a traditional church ceremony. Carolyn was just 19.
We were married on Easter Sunday, and it was a blizzard. And I remember in the receiving line, this lady shook my hand and she says, "I hope your married life is not as snowy as your wedding day." And I've never forgotten it.
After the wedding, the young couple worked hard to get ahead. Billy joined the Air Force to earn money so they both could go to college. And soon they started a family.
We had our goals that I think were aligned together. So I thought we were a very good match.
2 children later, Carolyn graduated and worked to help support them while Billy finished his PhD in botany. But as Billy's graduation day grew closer, Carolyn began to notice a change in her husband's behavior.
Billy was seldom around. He was coming in late, a lot of nights drinking with friends. I don't know if he was feeling some pressures, but when Billy was under stress, he became very intolerant.
He would belittle her, so the particular argument that she had was ridiculous. Sometimes you could hear things getting thrown and that type of thing.
Billy's temper was troubling, and one night he suddenly became violent.
I don't know what the argument was, but he hit me. He socked me. And I had this black eye. And I was thinking, how can this be?
But Carolyn was determined to stick with her young marriage.
I made a decision that day that you're not giving up your marriage, you're not giving up your hopes and dreams. You just put it away, go on, this won't happen again.
Meanwhile, on the outside, life for the couple was looking up. Billy graduated with his PhD and found a good job at a chemical lab. But as the years went by, he had bigger ambitions.
He decided to take some things that he had developed and start his own business. So I was the breadwinner. I would teach all day and go work the business at nights and weekends.
With Carolyn's help, Billy built an agricultural chemical company from the ground up. And by the time the kids were grown and out of the house, business was booming. By the late 1990s, the Coxes were millionaires. The small-town sweethearts had come a long way.
They made a lovely, lovely couple. They had earned everything on their own, and I admired them for that.
We were considered like almost the perfect couple. We really were. We had succeeded, we had done well.
After nearly 4 decades together, the couple had finally achieved their dream. But Carolyn was about to wake to a terrible reality. On the night of September 12, 2004, Carolyn was packing their bags for a much-needed getaway to France with friends.
I never had been to Europe, so I was very happy.
But she and Billy would never get on that plane. The next morning, around 6 a.m., Carolyn woke to a sharp pain in her head.
The next thing I know is I'm on the rug being pulled down the hall.
Barely conscious, Carolyn felt herself being moved into the garage. Her nightmare was just beginning. Carolyn was under attack, and the assault would cost her her husband and nearly her life.
He said, "You're worth more dead than alive."
And I'm like, what are you? You're not a human being.
In the spring of 1996, 8 years before the attack that would leave Carolyn Cox clinging to life, she and her husband Billy were hard at work growing their successful business.
It all gradually came together. We felt very good about what we had accomplished. We felt like we had reached those things that we had set out to reach.
But as the couple's net worth ballooned, so did their problems at home. Billy's temper had gone from bad to worse.
As he became more successful, I think he felt even more that he was above it all. Everything that he did, every shot he called, it was going to be his way or there was no way.
There was a very, very dark side that he didn't know when it could occur. So there was this fear at all times of when it possibly could come out. So you were careful.
More and more, Billy's anger would turn physical, often with no provocation.
We were sitting in the hot tub one night and we were talking, and I said something he didn't like, and with the back of the hand he just suddenly hit me across the face. It was just so out of the blue.
Sometimes Billy's outbursts would leave their mark, but Carolyn took pains to hide the truth, even from her closest friends.
She would come to meetings sometimes in a neck brace or with her arm in a sling or a patch over her eye. Carolyn always had an excuse for these injuries. And to be quite honest, the general opinion was that Carolyn was a klutz.
At times, Carolyn thought about ending her marriage, but Billy's violent streaks didn't happen often.
These bad times might not show up for a year. And in between that, he could be very loving and he could be affectionate. When we would go for these spans and not having anything happen, I truly felt they would never happen again. And so when they showed up, I was always in shock.
But problems at home didn't slow down the family business. By 2002, the couple was worth $15 million and living in a 12,000 square foot mansion in Bull Valley, Illinois.
It was Carolyn's dream house. And they enjoyed entertaining for fundraisers and functions in Bull Valley.
We were living the dream. Being able to stand back and look at that and say, look what you have, how fortunate you are.
But it never seemed to be enough for Billy. He soon became obsessed with money, counting and recounting every penny they had.
He was constantly making records of his net worth. And he had some fixation on insurance. He was always buying insurance policies.
By the spring of 2004, Billy was acting even stranger.
If I touched him, his body was rigid. I would start to hug him, and it was almost like hugging a board. I just remember wondering, what is going on?
But one thing was better. Billy hadn't been violent towards Carolyn in over a year. Until one night, when he said something that gave her pause.
He bought an insurance policy on my life, and he was going over the information, and he said, "You're worth more dead than alive."
Carolyn knew that life insurance policy was worth more than $1 million, but they hardly needed the money, so she tried to laugh it off.
I refused to take it any other way. I turned to him and I said, "Well, I'm so glad that's not true."
Little did Carolyn realize just how deep Billy's anger was.
He looked at me with eyes that was just ice cold.
I thought, this looks like a photograph of a corpse.
In the summer of 2004, Billy and Carolyn Cox were the pillars of their Bull Valley community.
I was very involved active in the community and very happy in what I was doing.
But behind closed doors, the golden couple's marriage remained far from picture perfect.
We had gone to an event at a friend's home, and when it was time for us to leave, one of my friends said, "It is so nice to see a couple who've been together so many years who still love each other." And he turned with the most hatred and the worst anger and said to me, "That may change at any moment."
Billy's anger seemed to be building, and Carolyn had no idea why. So when good friends Beth and Jim Wester proposed a vacation in France, Carolyn was eager for a change of scenery.
Billy's initial reaction to it was that we shouldn't go, and I said, "If we don't take advantage of this, I'm afraid we'll never do it." Then he seemed to be going along with it.
But Billy and Carolyn would never board that plane. On the morning of September 13th, 2004, Carolyn awoke to a crushing pain in her head. Dazed, she had no idea what was happening.
My first sense of something was my husband lifting me off the bed, and I reached for him. And the next thing I know is I'm on the rug being pulled by him down the hall, and I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "You fell out of bed and hit your head. I'm taking you to the doctor."
Billy dragged Carolyn down to the garage.
He placed me right on the cold concrete floor out there. And I kept saying, "Where's the ambulance? Where's the ambulance?" And he said, "They are on other jobs."
Bleeding heavily, Carolyn slipped in and out of consciousness, praying that Billy would be able to help her. But her prayers were in vain.
As I'm lying there with my eyes shut, all of a sudden, something hit me across the left side of my face. I said, "I think I'm dying." And he just stood there. He didn't do anything. He didn't say anything.
Instead, Billy picked her up, dumped her into the back of his SUV, started it, and walked away.
I'm in the car, and I'm realizing it's getting really hot. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. And I kept telling myself, "You'll die. You can't go to sleep. You have to do something."
With her last ounce of strength, Carolyn managed to crawl to the garage door, only to find that it was locked. Then she knew her husband of 43 years wasn't going to help her. He was trying to kill her.
I did not understand till those doors were locked what he was really doing.
Meanwhile, the Westers had been trying to reach them. They were scheduled to leave for the airport.
I called him at 8:30 in the morning, but nobody answered. And I said, well, that's odd.
But as the morning wore on and still no word from the Coxes, Jim began to worry.
Around 10:30, I realized this is not right. This is not normal. Nobody would answer any of the phones. And then I kept thinking, their house is way off the road. What if something happened?
I get a phone call from Beth Wester, and she says, do you think maybe that we should call the police?
Around 12:30 p.m., local police arrived at the house. He climbed through an open window and made a gruesome discovery.
He literally encountered a bloodbath in the foyer. He entered into the garage. The garage was full of carbon monoxide, and it was very hot in there. He observed Carolyn laying across the front seat of Billy Cox's truck, bleeding heavily from her face, and she said to him, "Help me," and then she lost consciousness.
As paramedics worked to save Carolyn, Billy mysteriously appeared, claiming he'd been outside on the grounds all morning.
He was standing there very calmly and said, "Did she fall?" At that point, the chief was very suspicious of what had occurred.
Carolyn was rushed to the hospital, and police began to question Billy. But soon he complained of chest pains and was taken to the same hospital as his dying wife.
They take me back to the room where my mother was, and I looked at her and I didn't even recognize her. And she said, "Why did he do this to me?" They said that my father had been brought in, and do you want to see him? When I got in there, there's the face of complete bull. Never asked about my mother until the very end.
Doctors could find nothing wrong with Billy, so he did what any man would do when his wife's life was hanging by a thread. He went out to dinner.
The chief was immediately suspicious of Billy because of the crime scene. Someone was cleaning up that foyer. There were rugs that had been rolled up that were full of her blood. There was also no explanation as to why the garage doors were all disabled, vehicles were running, and the door entering into the home was locked.
The evidence appeared to point in one direction. As soon as Billy finished his pork chops, police brought him in and arrested him.
Why would you take it to that level? Could have divorced her. Not only was he trying to kill her, he was trying to make her suffer.
2 days later, Carolyn awoke from surgery to hearing loss, metal plates in her face, and damaged vision. She was in shock that the man she had devoted her entire life to had just tried to kill her.
The coming to and knowing, oh, the heartbreak, it's just the devastation. I couldn't believe it. I lost my husband. I nearly lost my life, and I lost my husband.
But beyond heartbroken, Carolyn was also afraid. Billy had posted bail, and his reign of terror was far from over.
I believe that he wanted Carolyn dead.
I was just terrified all the time.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In September 2004, the exclusive town of Bull Valley, Illinois, was shaken to its core. Billy Cox, one of its most prominent residents, had brutally attacked his wife, Carolyn.
The story was front page, and the people in the area were just in shock.
Even Carolyn's closest friends didn't see it coming.
It kind of blew me away. I mean, you just look at this whole thing and you realize I didn't know the guy at all. I was seeing what he wanted me to see.
4 days after the attack, Carolyn filed for divorce from her hospital bed. The golden couple's marriage was over.
You saw her heart was broken, and that was very hard.
When she was finally released, Carolyn insisted on returning home. Billy was out on bail, and despite a restraining order, she was still afraid of him.
He was seen at the end of my drive. He was seen going up and down the street. And I was just terrified all the time.
There were many phone calls I had with her where she was sobbing, and I kept telling her to just have faith that eventually we would get to trial and justice would prevail.
In March 2007, 2.5 years after the attack, Billy finally had his day in court.
Billy's defense was that Carolyn decided to walk into the garage and climb up a ladder, and she fell backwards, and a board struck her on the front of her face. I had no doubt that Billy Cox was trying to kill Carolyn on that day. He tortured his wife for more than 6 hours that morning.
On the stand, Billy denied everything.
He has a very sinister side to him. He showed no empathy at all for Carolyn.
The jury sided with Carolyn. On April 11, 2007, Billy Joe Cox was convicted of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. To date, he has never admitted what he did to his wife that day, or why.
I don't believe the initial attack was premeditated. Billy Cox had abused her throughout their 40-year marriage repeatedly. He hit her hard enough this time, though, that no one was going to believe that she fell. So he realized that he had to end her life in order to protect himself.
Even behind bars, Billy's rage continued to burn. In 2009, he was investigated for allegedly trying to put a hit out on Carolyn.
I was informed that he had been approaching another inmate, asking him to kill Carolyn.
I know he has friends within the prison, so there is definitely fear that he can hurt me.
7 painful surgeries later, Carolyn's face has been repaired, and she's finally mending her heart.
A year and a half after this happened to me, I met Dennis, who is my husband. He's a caregiver, a very loving man, and I'm very happy.
It's wonderful to see my mom happily married. She absolutely deserves it. It's about time.
Today, Carolyn devotes her time to speaking on behalf of victims of domestic violence.
There's this myth that happens to less educated people or poor people, but there are many people that are in a domestic violence situation that are just like me.
Now, Carolyn knows that some marriages shouldn't last forever. But the sadness still lingers.
It's tough to cope with the heartbreak. It's always going to be there. It gets better, but it'll always be there.
The cruiser's lights cut through the dark like a blade, red and blue bouncing off wet asphalt. A routine traffic stop on a quiet Ohio back road that should have lasted no more than 5 minutes. The kind of moment that never makes the news, never makes history, except sometimes it does. Sometimes a hand reaches into a glove compartment and the past comes spilling out. Sometimes a name spoken into a radio wakes a ghost that has been sleeping for 20 years. In 1999, this road didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like safety. A town tucked between cornfields and low factories, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and their kids rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on, where nothing ever really happened, at least nothing people wanted to talk about. That illusion shattered the night Emily Carter disappeared. She was 17. Brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. A part-time job at a grocery store. Honor roll. Known by everyone, understood by no one. On the night she vanished, she told her mother she'd be back by 10. She never was. Her car was found the next morning, parked crooked near an abandoned rail spur, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no note. Just silence, so loud it rattled the town. The headlines came fast. Teen missing in rural Ohio. Family desperate for answers. Police launch full search. Volunteers fanned out into the fields. Dogs tracked her scent to the edge of the gravel road, then stopped cold, as if she had stepped into thin air. Friends were questioned. Boyfriends scrutinized. Teachers interviewed. Every rumor became a lead. Every lead dissolved into nothing. By week 3, the tone changed. The word cold case crept into print. Detectives stopped knocking on doors.
Tippschlod.
Life resumed its shape, uneven and uncomfortable, like furniture rearranged after a break-in. Emily's bedroom stayed exactly the same. Her mother slept on the couch. Her father started driving longer routes home, just to avoid the rail spur. Years passed. The case file thickened, but went nowhere. A red scarf found near the river, not hers. A truck reported speeding away that night, never identified. A local man questioned twice. Alibi checked. Cleared. Forgotten. Each lead raised hope just long enough to crush it again. The town learned how to live with the unanswered question hanging over it like low fog. In 2005, the investigation was officially scaled back. In 2010, it was quietly reclassified. Cold case. No active suspects. No new evidence. Emily Carter became a name spoken softly, then rarely, then almost never, except on anniversaries, except when someone new moved to town and asked why the rail spur felt wrong. What no one knew was that the answer was still moving through Ohio, changing addresses, changing jobs, changing faces, carrying the weight of that night like a shadow stitched to his heels. The traffic stop happened just after midnight. Speeding. Broken taillight. The officer approached the vehicle like he had 1,000 times before, hand resting near his holster, eyes scanning the interior, cluttered back seat, coffee cups, fast food wrappers. A man in his early 40s gripping the steering wheel too tightly for a simple citation. License and registration. The name on the license didn't ring any bells. It shouldn't have. It was new.
Clean.
But something in the man's hands trembled, just slightly, as he passed the documents over. The officer ran the plates.
Routine. Standard.
And then the system paused, just a second too long, before returning a hit that wasn't supposed to exist.
A flag. Old.
Buried. A partial match tied to an unsolved missing persons case from 1999. The officer looked back at the car, at the man now staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, breath shallow. The radio crackled. A supervisor was notified. Another cruiser rolled in. The stop stretched from minutes into something heavier, something charged. They asked him to step out of the vehicle. In the trunk, beneath a false panel that looked like it had never been disturbed, they found items that didn't belong in any normal life. A faded Ohio high school ID. A rusted keychain shaped like a star. A notebook filled with dates, names, and one entry circled over and over again. Emily. By sunrise, the town was waking up to sirens it hadn't heard in decades. News vans lined streets that hadn't seen cameras since the disappearance. The words "cold case closed" flashed across screens before anyone fully understood what they meant. But closure is a dangerous word. Because as detectives reopened the file, as they laid photographs across metal tables and compared timelines long thought irrelevant, the story that emerged wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. It wasn't the tidy ending people had waited 20 years to receive. The suspect talked.
Slowly. Carefully.
He admitted to knowing Emily, to being on that road, to giving her a ride. He denied everything else. No body.
No confession. No final proof.
Evidence was circumstantial, powerful, but fragile. Memories had faded. Witnesses had moved or died. The rail spur had been rebuilt. The river dredged. Time had done what time always does, it erased. And suddenly the town that thought it was finally getting answers realized something far worse. They were about to relive everything. The search resumed, not in fields this time, but in archives, in attics, in the back rooms of police departments where boxes gathered dust and secrets rot. Every choice made in 1999 was re-examined. Every missed opportunity replayed. Every silence questioned. And hanging over it all was the same unbearable truth that had haunted them from the beginning. Emily Carter still hadn't been found. Her disappearance, once a wound, now reopened into something raw and bleeding, a reminder that even when a cold case is declared closed, the past doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it drives quietly through the night. And sometimes it only takes a broken taillight to bring it all screaming back. By the second day after the arrest, the town had split clean down the middle, not by streets or neighborhoods but by belief, by whether people were ready to accept that the answer had finally arrived or whether they sensed something rotten beneath the headline glow, because cold case closed looks neat on a screen but feels dangerously premature when the body is still missing and the story refuses to line up cleanly. Detectives reopened every interview transcript from 1999, voices frozen in time, teenagers who were now middle-aged, officers who had retired, supervisors who had signed off on decisions they could barely remember making. Emily's last confirmed movements were reconstructed minute by minute: the grocery store time clock, the receipt from a gas station 2 miles out, a blurry security frame showing her car passing under a flickering streetlight at 9:42 p.m., the last moment she existed in a world that could be proven. The suspect's name echoed through those old pages like an afterimage. He had been there all along, not as a suspect, not even as a person of interest, just a background figure, a man whose name appeared once in a witness list then vanished. He'd been questioned briefly, dismissed quickly, another local face among hundreds. At the time, he was younger, leaner, quieter, working odd jobs, drifting between towns, leaving no footprints deep enough to follow. Now, 2 decades later, his story was smooth in places and jagged in others. He claimed Emily flagged him down near the rail spur, said she was upset, said she asked for a ride, said he dropped her off not far from the river.
No witnesses. No proof.
Just his word, delivered with practiced calm, punctured only by moments when his eyes flicked away, when his breathing changed, when silence stretched too long. The notebook found in his trunk became the center of gravity. Page after page of dates that matched nothing investigators could immediately identify. Addresses that no longer existed. Initials that meant nothing to anyone alive. And then Emily's name, written once, twice, dozens of times, circled so hard the paper tore, ink bleeding through like a wound. He said it was obsession, not guilt. Said he followed the case like everyone else. Said he wrote her name because it haunted him, because the mystery consumed him, because he wanted answers too. Detectives stared at him across the table, knowing that obsession doesn't explain a hidden compartment, doesn't explain souvenirs that should have disintegrated years ago, doesn't explain why a man keeps the artifacts of a missing girl close enough to reach from the driver's seat. Outside the interrogation room, pressure mounted. National outlets descended. True crime forums lit up. Old theories resurfaced with a vengeance. Was it a lone predator, or had he been part of something larger? Was Emily taken impulsively, or planned for weeks? Had she died that night, or had she been held somewhere unseen, unheard, for days, weeks longer? The river was searched again. Ground-penetrating radar swept the fields beyond the rail spur. Cadaver dogs traced paths that led nowhere, stopped, doubled back, confused by time and human interference. Each unsuccessful search deepened the dread that the truth had slipped through their fingers years ago, lost to construction crews and erosion and memory. Emily's parents returned to the center of the storm they had tried to escape. Cameras followed them from their porch to their car. Reporters asked if they felt relief, if they believed justice was finally coming, if they forgave the man now sitting in a county jail cell. Her mother said nothing. Her father said only this: "We're tired of being told it's over." As the case unfolded, uncomfortable questions surfaced about the original investigation. A patrol log that had gone missing. An anonymous tip never followed up. A witness who claimed to have seen a man matching the suspect's description arguing with Emily near the rail spur, dismissed because the witness had been drinking. Each oversight felt small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The suspect's past was pulled apart thread by thread. A string of short-term jobs. Sudden relocations. A name change filed quietly in another state. A sealed juvenile record that required court orders to access. When it was finally opened, what emerged was a history of violence that had never fully surfaced, incidents smoothed over, charges dropped, stories that ended without conclusions. Still, none of it answered the question that mattered most. Where was Emily? Prosecutors hesitated. Without a body, without a confession, the case was fragile. Defense attorneys circled like sharks, already shaping a narrative of coincidence and prejudice, of a man targeted because he was convenient, because the town needed someone to blame, because time had turned uncertainty into desperation. And then a call came in from 3 counties over. A woman cleaning out her late father's storage unit had found something wrapped in plastic, buried beneath old furniture and rusted tools. A box. Inside, a red scarf, a star-shaped keychain, and a Polaroid photograph, faded but unmistakable, showing a girl with brown hair standing near a riverbank, fear frozen in her eyes, a date scrawled on the bottom in black marker. The scarf matched one reported missing from Emily's room. The keychain matched the one found in the suspect's trunk. The handwriting on the photo matched the notebook. The storage unit had been rented under an alias now definitively linked to the suspect. For the first time since the traffic stop, the investigation felt like it was accelerating instead of chasing its own shadow. Warrants were issued. Locations connected to the suspect's past were searched. A remote property he'd owned briefly in the early 2000s was excavated, dirt peeled back layer by layer under floodlights and drones. Nothing. No remains.
No grave.
Just disturbed soil and fragments of trash, too recent, too clean, too empty. The discovery that should have ended the mystery only deepened it. Because the photograph proved Emily had survived the night she disappeared. And that meant whatever happened next had been deliberate, calculated, and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined back in 1999, when they still believed the worst had already happened. The suspect stopped talking after that, lawyered up, sat silently as evidence stacked higher around him, a fortress built on implication and inference. The media declared him a monster. Online sleuths declared the case solved. But inside the investigation rooms, no one used that word anymore.
Solved.
Because every answer raised two new questions, and every step closer to the truth revealed just how much had been missed, ignored, or buried the first time around. The cold case was no longer cold. It was burning, and it was far from over. The moment the photograph went public, the town lost whatever fragile balance it had been clinging to, because proof that Emily had lived beyond the night of her disappearance didn't bring comfort. It detonated something darker, something corrosive, the realization that while they were searching fields and rivers and ditches in 1999, she may have been somewhere close enough to hear cars passing, close enough to scream, close enough to be missed. Investigators rewound the clock again, this time with different eyes, charting every property, every structure, every place a person could hide another human being without drawing attention.
Sheds.
Basements. Abandoned farmhouses swallowed by weeds. Motels that no longer existed, their names remembered only through tax records and yellowed receipts. The suspect's movements were overlaid onto the map like a spreading stain, his short stays and sudden departures forming a pattern that suggested urgency, fear, control. The alias he had used to rent the storage unit led to others. Different names, different states, always the same handwriting. In one rental agreement from 2000, the signature pressed so hard into the paper it left an imprint on the page beneath, a detail that sent a quiet shiver through the room when analysts compared it to the torn notebook pages found in his trunk. Pressure, repetition, compulsion. Former neighbors were tracked down and questioned. People who had once lived next door to a man they barely remembered, a man who kept himself, who worked nights, who had curtains drawn at all hours. One woman recalled hearing noises she couldn't explain, thumps and muffled sounds that she told herself were machinery, or television, or nothing at all. Another remembered a girl's bike leaning against a fence for a few days, then gone. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Nothing ever does until it's too late. As the narrative shifted, so did the public's tone. The headlines grew sharper. New evidence suggests teen lived for days after disappearance. Ohio cold case takes dark turn. The phrase routine traffic stop was repeated endlessly, as if people needed to believe that justice arrives by accident, that monsters are caught not through meticulous failure, but through luck, a broken taillight, a bored officer doing his job. Emily's parents refused to watch the coverage. They sat instead with detectives, hour after hour, absorbing details no family should ever hear, asking questions that had no answers, pushing for certainty where none existed. They wanted timelines, locations,
A body.
something to anchor their grief to reality. What they got instead was a theory. Prosecutors believed Emily had been held for at least 3 days. The photograph's timestamp, corroborated by weather patterns visible in the background, suggested it was taken after a storm that hit the area 48 hours after her disappearance. That meant captivity, movement, intent. It meant she wasn't lost. She was controlled. The suspect's silence became its own statement. He sat through hearings without reaction, eyes forward, expression neutral, as if he were watching a movie he had already seen. His defense team worked quietly, filing motions to suppress evidence, challenging the legality of the traffic stop, questioning the chain of custody on items found in the trunk. They argued obsession, not action. Curiosity, not crime. A man fascinated by tragedy, not responsible for it. Then came the voicemail. It was discovered almost by accident, buried in an obsolete answering machine pulled from a box in the Carter family attic. Emily's mother had kept it for years, unable to throw it away, a relic from a time when voices lived on tape. A technician digitizing old recordings flagged one message for review. It was dated 3 days after Emily vanished.
Static.
Breathing. And then a whisper.
Mama, I'm scared.
The call cut off abruptly. No location data. No background noise clear enough to identify. But the voice was hers. Experts confirmed it. The room fell silent when the playback ended, the sound of it lingering like a bruise. The voicemail rewrote everything. If Emily had called home, even briefly, then she had access to a phone. If she had access to a phone, then someone had either allowed it or failed to prevent it. Both possibilities were equally horrifying. Investigators traced payphones in the area active at that time, narrowing down locations based on call routing technology that barely existed 2 decades earlier. 3 possible sites emerged, all within a 15-mile radius of properties once linked to the suspect. Search warrants followed. One site, a derelict gas station, yielded nothing but rust and graffiti. Another, a closed roadside diner, had been demolished years ago. The third was a farmhouse, abandoned but still standing, hidden behind rows of trees, its windows dark and unbroken. Inside, they found signs of habitation long after it should have been empty. A mattress on the floor, rope fibers embedded in the wood of a support beam, and scratched into the paint near the back door, barely visible beneath layers of grime, a single word.
Ink.
The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation, but it also exposed its most dangerous weakness. Everything pointed to the suspect, everything suggested prolonged captivity, and yet the one thing that could end all doubt remained missing. Emily herself. Without her remains, the case hovered in a legal limbo, strong enough to indict, weak enough to collapse under the right pressure. Prosecutors debated strategy late into the night, weighing the risk of moving forward against the agony of waiting longer. The community watched, breath held, caught between hope and dread. And then, just as the narrative seemed to be locking into place, something surfaced that threatened to unravel it all. A former inmate came forward, claiming the suspect had confessed years earlier while they were housed together in a state facility under different names. The confession, he said, wasn't about Emily. It was about another girl. Another disappearance, another town, another year, a case that had never been connected, never even suspected to be part of something larger. Records confirmed the inmate and the suspect had overlapped briefly in custody. But the details the inmate provided were vague, inconsistent, shifting under scrutiny. Still, the implication was devastating. If the suspect had done this before, then Emily's case wasn't an anomaly. It was a chapter. And the possibility that there were more chapters, unwritten, undiscovered, sent a chill through everyone involved, because it meant the cold case they thought they were closing might only be the beginning of something far worse. The investigation widened. Databases were cross-referenced. Missing persons cases from the late 90s and early 2000s were re-examined for similarities. Patterns emerged where none had been seen before. Similar ages. Similar locations. Similar vanishing acts that left behind cars, bags, silence. The traffic stop that reopened one wound was now tearing at many. And as the scope of the truth expanded, one question began to eclipse all others, whispered in hallways and meeting rooms and sleepless homes across Ohio. How many times had he done this? And how many answers were still buried, waiting for someone to stumble over them in the dark? The idea that Emily might not have been the first settled over the investigation like a thick, suffocating fog, because once that door opened it refused to close again. Every missing person report from the era suddenly pulsing with new meaning, every unsolved disappearance demanding to be re-examined not as an isolated tragedy, but as a potential echo. Task forces were expanded overnight. Analysts who had never touched the Carter file were pulled in, eyes unclouded by 20 years of frustration. They laid cases side by side on long tables, pinning photographs, timelines, maps, looking for overlap not just in geography but in psychology. Young women, transitional spaces, roads that led nowhere, cars left behind like abandoned shells. One case stood out immediately. A 19-year-old college student who vanished in 2001, 40 miles west. Her car found near a river access point. Keys in the ignition. No sign of violence. At the time, it was chalked up to a voluntary disappearance. She was legally an adult. She'd argued with her boyfriend. She wanted out. That was the official story. No one ever proved it. Another case followed. A 16-year-old runaway reported missing in late 1998, weeks before Emily. She'd been labeled high-risk, transient, difficult. The search had been minimal. Her trail went cold within days. No one connected it to anything else. Until now. When investigators overlaid the suspect's employment records, something ugly snapped into focus. He had worked within a 10-mile radius of all 3 disappearances, each job lasting only weeks, each ending abruptly. In 2 instances, he had left town within 48 hours of the girls being reported missing. Coincidence has a shelf life. This had exceeded it. The defense team felt the ground shifting and moved quickly, filing motions to sever cases, to prevent prosecutors from introducing evidence of other alleged crimes. They argued contamination, prejudice, a narrative built on speculation rather than fact. They reminded the court that no bodies had been found, that no physical evidence directly tied their client to a murder. That suspicion, no matter how heavy, was not proof. Behind closed doors, prosecutors wrestled with the same truth. They had momentum, but momentum is not a verdict. The public wanted blood. The law demanded certainty. Emily's voicemail became both weapon and liability. The defense claimed it could have been staged, misidentified, recorded earlier, and misdated. Experts disagreed, but doubt lingered, as it always does, worming its way into any gap left by time. The farmhouse, too, was attacked as circumstantial, its markings dismissed as coincidence, its rope fibers explained away as agricultural remnants. And then there was the suspect himself. He began to change. Guards noted shifts in behavior. Less control. Less polish. He started asking questions not about Emily but about evidence, about timelines, about what investigators knew and what they didn't. He requested to see photographs, then abruptly canceled. He paced his cell at night.
He stopped eating.
In one monitored conversation with his attorney, he muttered a phrase that would later haunt everyone who heard it. They always forget the first one. The recording was ambiguous, contextless, impossible to pin down legally, but it landed like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through every theory being built around him. Investigators doubled down on the earliest case, the 1998 runaway. Her name was Laura. She had bounced between foster homes. She had no stable address. No one to demand answers when she disappeared. Her file was thin, almost insultingly so. But buried inside was a single note from a volunteer who claimed Laura had mentioned getting rides from an older man who liked to help girls who needed it. No name, no description, just a feeling. That volunteer had died years earlier. Records showed Laura's last known location was a bus stop near an industrial park where the suspect had briefly worked as a night security guard. The overlap was undeniable. What was missing was the proof. Search warrants expanded beyond Ohio. Properties linked to the suspect in neighboring states were flagged. 1. A wooded parcel purchased under yet another alias in 2002 had never been developed. Satellite imagery showed disturbances inconsistent with natural growth. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They alerted. Excavation began under tight security, the air thick with expectation and dread. Hours passed, then days. Dirt gave way to rock, rock to roots, roots to nothing. Another dead end. The media's tone shifted again, frustration bleeding into skepticism. Was the case being inflated? Were investigators forcing connections where none existed? The phrase witch hunt appeared in op-eds. Commentators questioned whether desperation was driving the narrative more than evidence. Emily's parents withdrew from public view. They had heard enough theories to last a lifetime. What they wanted now was finality, even if it came in the form of something unbearable. The suspect's past continued to unravel. Financial records revealed payments to storage facilities, cash withdrawals clustered around the dates of disappearances, purchases of rope, tarps, cleaning supplies. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they painted a portrait of preparation. Then came the forensic breakthrough no one had expected. Advances in touch DNA allowed analysts to re-examine the items found in the suspect's trunk. The high school ID, the keychain, the notebook. On the edge of the Polaroid photograph, beneath a smudge long dismissed as damage, they found skin cells. The profile was partial, degraded, but when it was run through updated databases, it returned a familial match. Emily's cousin. The odds of transfer were debated. Secondary contact. Innocent explanation. But the presence of her DNA on an item tied directly to the suspect collapsed the defense's central claim that he was merely an observer, a collector of tragedy rather than its architect. Still, one final piece was missing. The suspect requested to speak. No lawyer. No conditions. The room was silent when he sat down, thinner now, eyes sunken, the mask slipping in ways it never had before. He asked for water.
He asked for time.
Then he began to talk, not in confessions but in fragments, disjointed memories, moments that circled the truth without landing on it. He described fear.
Control.
The thrill of being unseen. He spoke about Emily in the present tense, then corrected himself, visibly shaken. He mentioned places investigators had never publicly disclosed. He stopped short of admitting to killing her, but he didn't deny it either. When the interview ended, detectives sat in stunned silence, knowing they had just heard something that would never make it cleanly into court, but would live with them forever. Outside, the town waited. Not for justice. For certainty. But certainty was proving to be the one thing this case refused to give. Because even now, even with the net tightening, even with evidence stacking higher by the day, the truth remained just out of reach, obscured by years of missed chances and buried decisions. And somewhere, beneath layers of earth or water or memory, the answer was still hiding. Watching. Waiting. By the time the suspect spoke again, the word closure had vanished from every official statement, scrubbed clean like something dangerous, something that tempted fate, because the deeper investigators pushed, the clearer it became that this case didn't want to end neatly, didn't want to resolve into a single headline or a single arrest. It wanted to fracture, to splinter outward, dragging old failures into the light one by one. The second interview was different.
No wandering fragments. No philosophical detours.
This time his voice was flat, stripped of performance, as if exhaustion had burned away the need to manipulate. He asked one question before anything else. Do her parents still live in the house? No one answered. He nodded anyway, as if confirmation didn't matter, as if he already knew. He spoke about the night Emily disappeared with unsettling precision, details that had never been released, the exact angle of the rail's spur, the smell of rain on hot metal, the sound her car made when the engine cut out. He said she wasn't supposed to be scared. He said it like an apology. Or a justification. He described driving for hours. Back roads. No destination. Just distance.
He said she talked at first.
Asked questions. Tried to make him human. Then she stopped. He paused there for a long time, eyes fixed on the table, fingers tracing patterns in invisible dust. She figured it out, he said quietly, that I wasn't taking her home. Investigators pressed him. Locations.
Dates.
Names. He gave some. dodged others. When asked directly what happened to her, his jaw tightened, muscles twitching like wires pulled too hard. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." It was the closest thing to a confession they would ever get. Search teams moved again, this time guided by his partial directions, vague references to water and trees and a road that no longer existed. Landscapes had changed. Rivers had shifted. Entire stretches of land had been developed, paved over, repurposed. Each excavation felt like digging into a wound that had healed wrong. Nothing surfaced. Behind the scenes, prosecutors made a decision that would define the rest of the case. They would move forward without a body. They would argue pattern, behavior, probability. They would ask a jury to look at the totality of the evidence and see what the law sometimes struggles to name outright: truth. The defense responded with ferocity. They painted the investigation as a house built on sand, accused detectives of coercion, of confirmation bias, of building a monster because the community demanded one. They dissected every inconsistency, every gap, every moment where time had done what it always does: erase. Trial dates were set. Motions flew back and forth. The courtroom became a battlefield long before a jury ever entered. Outside, the town cracked open. People who had once trusted the system began questioning everything. Why certain tips weren't followed. Why Laura's case had been ignored. Why the suspect had slipped through so easily in the first place. Former officers were dragged back into the spotlight, forced to explain decisions made decades earlier under pressure they barely remembered. One retired detective broke down during a deposition, voice shaking as he admitted they had been overwhelmed, understaffed, chasing leads with technology that feels primitive now. He said they did their best. He said it wasn't enough. Emily's voicemail was played in court during a pretrial hearing, the sound of it slicing through the room with surgical precision. Jurors wept openly. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. The past didn't ask permission. Then, just weeks before jury selection, something surfaced that no one had anticipated. A fisherman, clearing debris from a stretch of river downstream from the rail spur, pulled up something that didn't belong. Fabric. Tangled. Heavy with silt. Law enforcement sealed off the area within minutes. The media arrived within hours. Forensic teams worked through the night. The remains were incomplete. Time and water had done their work, but dental records matched. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed what no one wanted to hear spoken aloud. Emily Carter had been found. The announcement hit like a physical blow. Grief flooded back with a violence that surprised even those who had lived with it for 20 years. Her parents were notified privately. The town mourned publicly. Candles lined the rail spur. Flowers clogged the fences. Silence returned to streets that had forgotten how to hold it. The suspect showed no visible reaction when informed. He stared at the wall, asked for a glass of water, said nothing. The discovery changed everything and nothing all at once. It strengthened the prosecution's case. It confirmed the worst. It ended the search. But it also raised questions that could never be answered now. How long she had suffered. Whether she had hoped, even briefly, that she would survive. Whether that voicemail had been a goodbye or a plea. The trial moved forward with renewed intensity. Experts testified. Patterns were laid bare. The defense clung to doubt, to the absence of direct evidence tying the suspect to the remains, to the possibility of contamination, coincidence, error. But the story had shifted. This was no longer about theory. It was about responsibility. As closing arguments approached, the weight of decades pressed down on everyone involved. Detectives who had chased the truth their entire careers. Prosecutors risking everything on a case that could redefine their legacy. A community forced to confront the cost of missed chances and comfortable assumptions. And at the center of it all, a man who had lived freely for years after taking something irreplaceable, now watching his past collapse inward, room by room, lie by lie. The verdict had not yet been spoken. But for the first time since 1999, the truth was no longer abstract. It was real. It was named. And it was impossible to ignore. The courtroom filled before sunrise on the first day of testimony, Rows of polished wood and stale air absorbing the collective breath of a town that had waited too long to be here, reporters lining the back wall, families of other missing girls sitting quietly together without speaking, bound by a fear that still didn't have a name, because if one truth had been buried for decades, how many others were still out there, undiscovered, unacknowledged, unresolved. The prosecution began with the river. Not the body, not yet, but the place. Photographs flooded the screens, wide shots of calm water under gray skies, close-ups of reeds and mud and debris, the kind of landscape people pass every day without seeing. They spoke about currents, about seasonal flooding, about how easy it is for something heavy to disappear and stay disappeared. They framed the river not as a coincidence, but as a choice. Witnesses followed, one after another. A relentless procession of memory and regret. The officer who found Emily's car in 1999, his voice cracking as he described the way the keys were still warm. The friend who waited for her at a party that night, checking her phone over and over until it died. The volunteer who had searched the fields, who still dreamed about calling her name into the dark. Then came the experts. Forensic analysts explained touch DNA to a jury that struggled to understand how something so small could carry such weight. They spoke carefully, precisely, never overstating, never promising certainty where science could only offer probability. Emily's DNA on the photograph, on the keychain, on the edge of the notebook page. Not once, multiple times. Consistent with prolonged handling. The defense objected, cross-examined, suggested transfer, contamination. They planted doubt wherever they could, because doubt was all they had left. But the pattern held. The voicemail played again. This time, no one cried. The room sat frozen, as if sound itself had become too dangerous to acknowledge. When it ended, the prosecutor didn't speak for several seconds. She let the silence do the work. The suspect never looked up. When Emily's remains were introduced into evidence, the courtroom shifted, a collective tightening, as if everyone understood instinctively that this was the point of no return. The medical examiner testified that the cause of death could not be definitively determined. Too much time. Too much damage. But there were signs of restraint, of confinement, of trauma consistent with prolonged captivity. The defense seized on the uncertainty, hammering it home. No cause of death.
No weapon. No witness. No confession.
They reminded the jury again and again that suspicion is not proof, that horror does not equal guilt, that emotion must not replace evidence. And then the prosecution called its most dangerous witness, the suspect himself. He had agreed to testify against the advice of his attorneys, a decision that stunned everyone involved. He took the stand slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the attention, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for all along. He spoke calmly at first, about his childhood, about feeling invisible, about drifting. He described meeting Emily as a coincidence, an accident of timing, a moment that spiraled beyond his control. He admitted to giving her a ride, admitted to lying to police in 1999, admitted to keeping items connected to her. But he denied killing her. She was alive when I left, he said. I swear that. The prosecutor approached carefully, methodically dismantling his story piece by piece. Why the aliases? Why the storage unit? Why the notebook? Why the photograph? Why the false panel in the trunk? Why the voicemail existed at all? His answers grew thinner, shorter, sharper. She wanted to leave, he snapped at one point. She wasn't a prisoner. The words hung in the air like poison. The prosecutor asked him if a 17-year-old girl taken from her car at night, driven for hours, held in unknown locations, and calling her mother in fear sounded like someone who wanted to leave. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled. Just slightly. The courtroom erupted.
Gasps. Shouts.
The judge slammed the gavel, restoring order. But something irreversible had already happened. The mask was gone. Whatever ambiguity had survived until that moment evaporated in the face of that expression, that flicker of control reasserting itself when he believed he was winning. The defense tried to recover. They redirected. They reframed. They emphasized inconsistencies. But the damage was done. In closing arguments, the prosecution told the jury this was not a case about a single night in 1999. It was about a pattern of choices. A man who exploited invisibility. A system that failed to see him. A girl who paid the price. The defense warned against vengeance masquerading as justice. Against letting a story feel true simply because it was horrifying. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 days of tension thick enough to choke on. 4 days of speculation and silence. 4 days where the town held its breath, afraid to hope, afraid to doubt. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom filled again, standing room only. The foreperson's hands shook as she read.
Guilty.
On all major counts. Emily Carter's parents clutched each other, grief and relief colliding in a way that left them visibly unsteady. The suspect showed no reaction.
No anger. No remorse.
He stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if the outcome had been decided long before anyone else caught up. The sentence would come later. Life without parole. The headlines that night were immediate, explosive, definitive. Ohio 1999 cold case closed. But inside the courtroom, among the investigators who had lived inside the story for years, no one used that phrase. Because even as one chapter ended, the weight of what remained pressed in from all sides. Other files. Other names. Other girls. The verdict did not answer those questions. It only made them impossible to ignore. The day after the verdict, the courthouse emptied and the cameras moved on, but the story didn't loosen its grip, it tightened, because justice delivered in one case has a way of illuminating everything it failed to touch, and now every unanswered disappearance in the region leaned forward, demanding to be seen in the same harsh light. Boxes were pulled from evidence rooms that hadn't been opened in years. Cardboard softened by humidity. Labels written in ink that had begun to fade. Names that never made headlines, never sparked candlelight vigils, never became symbols because no one had been there to insist they mattered. Investigators worked through them methodically, knowing that patterns only reveal themselves when someone finally bothers to look. The suspect was transferred to a maximum security facility 2 states away, his movements restricted, his contact with the outside world reduced to monitored calls and censored letters. But distance didn't erase his presence. In some ways, it amplified it, because now that the story was known, now that his name was fixed to Emily's fate, people began to see him everywhere he had once passed unnoticed. Former coworkers came forward. Neighbors who had moved away years earlier suddenly remembered details that felt insignificant at the time. A locked shed that no one else used. A generator running late at night. A smell that didn't belong to any machine they could identify. Each memory arrived warped by guilt, by hindsight, by the sickening realization that knowing too late is its own kind of complicity. One tip in particular changed the trajectory of everything. It came from a woman in her 60s, calling from a town just over the state line. She said she recognized the suspect's face from the coverage, recognized it instantly, with the clarity of someone who has been waiting decades for confirmation. In 2000, she said, her younger sister had gone missing. 19 years old. Hitchhiking after her car broke down. The case had gone nowhere.
No suspects. No closure.
She had always believed someone picked her sister up. And now she believed she knew who. Records confirmed the suspect had been working less than 5 miles from where the car was found. His name appeared nowhere in the original file. No one had ever checked. No one had thought to. The case was reopened within days. That single call opened a floodgate. Similar reports followed, each one a variation on the same nightmare. Young women stranded. Offered help. Vanishing without a trace. Cars recovered. Belongings left behind. Investigations that stalled because the victims didn't fit the narrative of innocence the public demanded in order to care. The prosecution team that had just finished the Carter trial found itself right back in the same rooms, staring at new walls filled with old faces. They coordinated with federal agencies now, the scope expanding beyond state lines, beyond anything they had anticipated when a routine traffic stop cracked the first seal. But here was the problem. The suspect had been convicted for Emily. Everything else was circumstantial. Without remains, without confessions, without witnesses willing or able to testify. The law had limits. And the law doesn't bend easily, even when the truth feels obvious. They tried anyway. Investigators returned to him, hoping the weight of a life sentence might loosen something, might coax out details that could give other families what Emily's parents had finally received. He listened,
Smiled faintly.
said nothing useful. In one recorded interview, when asked directly how many there were, he leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "You're assuming I kept count." After that, the interviews stopped. Outside prison walls, the impact rippled outward. Policy reviews were launched. Cold case units received funding they had been denied for years. Training protocols changed. The phrase lessons learned appeared in official reports, a sterile way of acknowledging that lives had been lost not only to violence, but to neglect. Emily's parents moved. They sold the house where her voice still lived in the walls, where every creak sounded like a memory trying to come back. They relocated quietly, without announcements or interviews, leaving behind a town that would forever associate their grief with its own shame. Each year, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, someone still leaves flowers at the rail spur. No one knows who started it. No one has ever seen who does it. The bouquets appear overnight, arranged carefully, respectfully, as if placed by someone who understands the cost of forgetting. The other families weren't as fortunate. Some cases advanced. Others collapsed under scrutiny, their connections too weak to survive legal challenge. A few yielded partial truths, fragments that hinted at involvement but never crossed the threshold required for charges. The system did what it always does in the face of uncertainty. It moved on. Years passed again, this time with the knowledge that the danger had been real, that the monster had not been imagined, that he had lived among them, unseen, for far too long. The community changed in subtle ways. Parents became more vigilant. Trust became conditional. Doors locked earlier. Silence grew heavier. And then, unexpectedly, something shifted. A guard at the prison reported unusual behavior. The suspect had requested paper. A lot of it. He wrote constantly, filling page after page with dense handwriting, then tearing it up, then starting again. When questioned, he said he was setting things straight. The pages were confiscated. Most of it was rambling, self-serving, attempts to control the narrative even now. But buried within the chaos were details.
Dates.
Locations. Descriptions that matched known disappearances with disturbing accuracy. Nothing that could be entered cleanly into evidence, but enough to reopen conversations. Enough to reopen wounds. One entry stood out. A description of a bridge.
Old. Steel.
Over a narrow river. He wrote about water depth, about timing, about how easy it was to misjudge what would sink and what would float. Investigators cross-referenced it against his travel history. One location matched perfectly. A place searched briefly years earlier, dismissed as irrelevant. This time, they went back with sonar. The scan revealed anomalies. Not definitive, not conclusive, but enough to justify a dive. When the diver surfaced, the crowd waiting on the riverbank fell silent. They carried something wrapped in netting, heavy with sediment, the shape beneath unmistakable. Another family received a call they had waited decades for. The news never reached the same volume as Emily's case. It didn't dominate national headlines. But for those who understood what it meant, it was seismic. One more answer. One less question. The suspect never acknowledged it publicly. Never admitted responsibility. Never reacted at all. But the writing stopped after that. No more pages. No more requests for paper. As if something inside him had finally closed. The case that began with a traffic stop had become something far larger than anyone involved could have predicted. A reminder that evil rarely announces itself, that it thrives in gaps and assumptions and silence, and that sometimes the difference between a life lost and a life saved is nothing more than whether someone chooses to look a second time. The cold case had been declared closed. but its shadow was still moving, still stretching, still reminding everyone who lived through it that the past doesn't stay past just because we want it to. It waits. And it watches. Time moved differently after that second recovery, slower somehow, heavier, as if every day carried the accumulated weight of all the days that had failed before it, because once one truth surfaced from the water, it became impossible to pretend the rest were unreachable, impossible to dismiss the quiet certainty settling into investigators' bones that this story still wasn't finished telling itself. The remains were identified within weeks. Another name added to a list that should never have existed. Another family pulled back from the edge of uncertainty into a grief that, paradoxically, felt easier to bear than not knowing. Press conferences were restrained now, voices careful, language measured. Officials spoke about ongoing reviews and potential connections, avoiding the words that once came too easily. Serial.
Pattern.
Failure. Behind the scenes, the work was relentless. Analysts rebuilt timelines not around the victims this time, but around the suspect himself, tracking every mile he had driven, every night he had clocked in and out, every gap in his documented history. Those gaps became the focus, dark pockets of time where anything could have happened, and probably did. Credit card records placed him near rest stops where disappearances had been reported. Old toll data surfaced, long thought erased, showing crossings that lined up with missing persons reports in 3 different states. Even the handwriting in his confiscated notes began to tell a story, pressure patterns changing when he wrote about certain places, certain years, his pen digging deeper as if the memory itself resisted being dragged into the open. Families watched from a distance, afraid to hope, afraid not to. Each new lead felt like a double-edged blade, capable of cutting through years of silence or opening wounds they had barely managed to close. Some refused to participate, unable to endure another cycle of anticipation and disappointment. Others insisted, pushing investigators harder than ever, demanding that every stone be turned, every river scanned, every stretch of forgotten land re-examined. The suspect remained silent. Letters sent to him by families went unanswered. Requests for interviews were ignored. He spent most days alone, refusing recreation, declining visits, existing in a controlled isolation that mirrored, uncomfortably, the captivity he had inflicted on others. Guards reported that he slept little, paced often, and reacted violently to sudden noise, a detail that felt less like punishment and more like revelation. One night, during a routine check, a guard noticed him standing motionless in his cell, staring at the wall. When asked if he needed medical attention, he replied without turning around, "They're louder at night." No report followed.
No evaluation.
Just another note in a logbook that would likely never be read again unless someone went looking for it years later. Investigators did go looking. They returned to sites dismissed decades earlier, places deemed too unlikely, too inconvenient, too expensive to search thoroughly at the time. A quarry filled with stagnant water, a stretch of woodland bordered by an industrial landfill, a drainage system beneath a decommissioned highway spur. Each search was a gamble, resources poured into hope, into the belief that truth leaves traces even when someone tries to erase it. Most came up empty. A few didn't. Fragments. Buttons. Fibers. A piece of jewelry warped by time, but still recognizable to someone who had stared at its photograph for half a lifetime. Each discovery was processed carefully, quietly, without spectacle. There was no appetite left for headlines, only for answers. The legal system lagged behind the investigation, as it often does. Charges were considered, debated, postponed. Without direct evidence tying the suspect to each recovery, prosecutors hesitated to move forward. Convictions won on pattern alone are rare. Appeals are not. The last thing anyone wanted was to jeopardize the certainty already achieved. So the work continued in a space between justice and truth, a place where the law can't always follow but conscience insists on going anyway. Emily's case became a reference point, a measuring stick for how badly things can go wrong when assumptions replace persistence. Training seminars cited it. Policy changes referenced it obliquely. New detectives learned her name not as a victim, but as a lesson. In the town where it began, life moved on in small, careful steps. New families moved in, unaware at first of the history beneath their feet. Older residents learned to speak about it without lowering their voices. The rail spur was cleared and repainted, not to erase what happened, but to acknowledge it openly, a physical marker that something terrible had occurred there and that pretending otherwise had never helped anyone. Every so often, someone would spot a familiar face at the flowers left overnight. A woman walking her dog before dawn. A man in a work jacket pausing longer than necessary. No one ever confronted them. The ritual belonged to everyone now. Years passed again. Then, without warning, the suspect collapsed in a cell. Medical staff responded quickly. He survived. But something changed after that. He began requesting meetings, asking questions, probing cautiously about what investigators knew, what they suspected, what they could prove. The balance of power shifted almost imperceptibly from defiance to negotiation. In one recorded conversation, he said, "If I talk, you have to promise me they'll remember me for more than one." The request chilled the room. Investigators didn't promise anything. They never could. But they listened. What followed was not a confession, not fully, but a roadmap. Locations described in vague terms, landmarks remembered imperfectly, memories filtered through years of self-justification and denial. It was infuriating, incomplete, painfully slow, but it was something. Search teams mobilized again, older now, wearier, but no less determined. And as they moved across the map he sketched in words, the pattern became undeniable. Routes repeated. Methods echoed. The randomness that once obscured the truth gave way to intention. This had never been chaos. It had been practice. The revelations didn't bring peace. They brought a deeper, quieter grief, the kind that settles into bones and stays there. The understanding that evil had been methodical, patient, sustained by indifference and luck. And yet, with every new recovery, every identification, something shifted. Names replaced numbers. Stories replaced speculation. And the cold case that had once seemed singular expanded into a reckoning far larger than anyone had wanted or expected or felt ready to face. The end was approaching. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the only way endings ever really come. One truth at a time. The first winter after the roadmap arrived was the hardest because cold has a way of preserving things people would rather forget, and every search conducted under gray skies felt like an excavation not just of land, but of time itself, each shovel of earth lifting questions that had waited decades to be asked out loud. The suspect talked in fragments, never giving a full picture, always stopping just short of clarity, as if he understood that control was his last remaining currency. He described turns taken after the 3rd-mile marker, fields that used to have horses, bridges painted green before they rusted. Investigators learned to translate his evasions into coordinates, into probable cause, into action. It was slow. It was maddening. It worked. One location yielded nothing but trash and animal bones. Another produced a shoe sole that matched no record. But the third search, conducted along a narrow creek fed by runoff from an industrial site, uncovered a shallow grave so poorly concealed it felt like an insult. The remains were identified within days. A missing persons report from 2003. A girl whose name had never trended, whose face had never been printed on posters outside grocery stores. Her family had been told she ran away. They had never believed it. As recoveries continued, the language changed again. Officials stopped saying possible connections. They stopped hedging. They began speaking about responsibility, about accountability, about the cost of not looking harder the first time. Press conferences were no longer about reassurance. They were about reckoning. The suspect's cooperation waxed and waned. Some days he spoke freely, reliving details with unsettling clarity. Other days he shut down entirely, staring through interviewers as if they were glass. Psychologists noted patterns consistent with someone who relished anticipation more than outcome, who valued being remembered over being understood. When asked why he was talking now, he answered without hesitation. Because you finally know what to ask. That answer echoed through every room it entered. The scope of the investigation forced uncomfortable alliances. State lines dissolved. Jurisdictions overlapped. Old rivalries were set aside out of necessity. Files were shared. Databases synchronized. For the first time, disparate cases began to cohere into a single narrative, one that stretched across years and counties and administrative failures that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. Some families received answers that brought a strange kind of peace. Others received confirmation of what they had always feared. A few received nothing at all, their cases remaining stubbornly unresolved, caught in the margins of the story, just out of reach of proof. The suspect's health declined. Hospital visits increased. Doctors warned that time was becoming a factor, that whatever he was willing to reveal needed to be revealed soon. Investigators pressed harder, walking a thin line between urgency and ethics, knowing that anything extracted improperly could poison everything else. One afternoon, during what would become one of the final interviews, he did something unexpected. He apologized. Not to the families. Not to the victims. To the investigators. "I wasted your time," he said, almost thoughtfully. "Back then. You were looking in the wrong places, because I wanted you to." The admission landed like a punch. Years of misdirection.
Tips planted.
Sightings fabricated. The chaos of the early searches hadn't been accidental. It had been engineered. He described standing at the edge of a search perimeter, watching volunteers comb fields he knew were empty. He described calling in anonymous tips, sending people running toward shadows while the truth stayed buried. He spoke with a detachment that made it clear he saw those moments not as crimes, but as victories. When asked if he felt anything now, any regret, any remorse, he considered the question carefully. "I feel finished," he said. That night, he was placed under suicide watch. He never attempted anything, but the message was clear. Whatever he was going to give them, he had already given most of it. The rest he intended to keep. Searches continued without him. Technology filled in gaps his memory couldn't or wouldn't address. Soil analysis identified sites likely disturbed in specific years. Environmental DNA pulled traces from water that traditional methods had missed. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Another recovery followed. Then another. Each one carried the same quiet devastation. A name restored. A photograph reclaimed from anonymity. A family asked to step into a future that would never look the way they had imagined. The town where Emily disappeared watched from a distance now, the epicenter of something far larger than itself. Locals spoke about the case with a kind of resigned clarity, no longer asking how it happened, but how it had been allowed to continue for so long. Schools added safety programs. Police departments added oversight. People learned to question their instincts about who looked harmless and who didn't. The rail spur became a place of deliberate memory. A plaque was installed, not just for Emily, but for all the names that had followed, etched into metal that would outlast the people who had once ignored them. It wasn't closure. It was acknowledgement. The suspect died in custody in early spring. Natural causes, according to the report. Complications exacerbated by years of neglect, both inflicted and endured. There was no final confession.
No dramatic reveal.
No last-minute redemption. Just a body removed quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The reaction was muted. There were no protests.
No celebrations.
Only a collective understanding that whatever satisfaction people thought they might feel at that moment had already been exhausted by years of waiting. His death ended one thing and complicated another. Without him, some answers would never come. Investigators released a final report months later. It outlined confirmed connections, probable links, and cases that would remain open indefinitely. It acknowledged mistakes. It named failures. It avoided excuses. The phrase cold case appeared once, in the past tense. For Emily's parents, life settled into something resembling peace, not because the pain had lessened, but because it had finally been given a shape. They visited the rail spur once more after the plaque was installed. They stood in silence. They left nothing behind. In other towns, other families stood at other sites, some newly marked, some still unmarked, grappling with the same complicated relief. Knowing is not the same as healing. Sometimes it's just the end of pretending. Years from now, the story will be retold differently. Simplified, condensed, turned into timelines and specials and documentaries that make it feel inevitable, as if the truth was always destined to surface. It wasn't. It was delayed. By chance.
By choice.
By silence. And when people speak about it now, about the traffic stop that started it all, they speak with a quiet reverence for the ordinary moments that carry extraordinary consequences, the broken taillights and routine decisions that can, without warning, change the shape of history. The cold case was closed. But what it revealed will never be. In the months after the suspect's death, the machinery of the investigation slowed but never truly stopped, because once truth has momentum, it doesn't simply vanish with the person who carried it. It lingers in files and habits and altered instincts, shaping how people work long after the spotlight moves on. The final report landed quietly. No press event.
No speeches.
Just a document uploaded to a government site most people would never visit, its pages dense with timelines, footnotes, and acknowledgments of error written in careful, legal language. It named confirmed victims. It listed probable connections. It outlined cases that would remain open, suspended in that uncomfortable space between suspicion and proof. What it didn't do was offer absolution. Inside law enforcement circles, the report became required reading. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest in ways reports rarely are. It admitted that early assumptions had narrowed vision, that certain victims had been deprioritized because they were inconvenient, because their lives didn't fit a clean narrative, that resources had followed headlines instead of patterns. Those admissions carried weight. Cold case units across the region changed how they worked. Anonymous tips were logged differently. Minor inconsistencies were flagged instead of dismissed. Interagency communication became standard instead of exceptional. None of it could undo what had happened, but it reshaped what might happen next. For the families, the aftermath was quieter and harder to define. Some sought civil action, not for money, but for acknowledgement. Settlements were reached behind closed doors. Apologies were issued carefully, legally, insufficiently. Others refused anything that felt like compensation, choosing instead to build memorials, foundations, scholarships bearing names that would not otherwise survive the passage of time. Emily Carter's name appeared in unexpected places. A lecture hall, a training manual, a case study discussed by recruits who hadn't been born when she disappeared. She became a reference point not for tragedy, but for vigilance, for the cost of overlooking the ordinary. The rail spur remained unchanged after the plaque, deliberately so.
No landscaping. No beautification.
Just steel and gravel and the quiet understanding that this was a place where something ended and something else began. On certain mornings, people would stop there without knowing exactly why, sit for a moment, then leave, carrying a weight they couldn't quite explain. Years later, an officer who had been on duty the night of the traffic stop retired. In his exit interview, he was asked what he would remember most from his career. He didn't hesitate. That stop, he said. Not because of what we found, because of how close we were to missing it. That sentence circulated briefly online, shared and reshared, stripped of context, turned into a quote. It resonated because it named something people don't like to confront, that justice often hinges not on grand heroism, but on attention, on someone doing a small job correctly when it would be easier not to. The story faded from national memory the way all stories eventually do. New cases took its place. New outrage. New tragedies. The algorithm moved on. But in the towns touched by it, the residue remained. Parents taught their children differently. Officers listened longer. People noticed things they once would have ignored. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of awareness. The understanding that danger doesn't always look dangerous, that it often wears familiarity like a disguise. Every so often, a new tip would arrive, A new theory, a new name suggested by someone convinced there was still more to uncover. Investigators followed up when they could. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found enough to add a footnote, a quiet update to a file that might never be reopened. That was the reality now. Not closure. Continuation. The suspect's grave went unmarked. There were no visitors.
No flowers.
No one claimed him. His name slipped gradually out of public use, replaced by the names of those he had taken, a subtle but deliberate reversal that felt, to some, like the only justice left. Emily's parents rarely spoke about the case anymore. When they did, it wasn't about him. It was about her. Her laugh. Her impatience. The way she used to sing along to the radio, always slightly off-key. They had learned, slowly, painfully, that memory is an act of resistance. On the 20th anniversary of the verdict, a small group gathered at the rail spur.
No cameras. No speeches.
Just people who understood what that place represented. They stood together for a while, then dispersed, each carrying their own version of the story forward. Because that's how these cases really end. Not with a sentence. Not with a headline. But with a quiet transfer of responsibility from those who lived through it to those who come after, a shared obligation to look closer, to question sooner, to refuse the comfort of easy explanations. The cold case had been closed on paper. In practice, it had done something far more dangerous. It had taught people how easily the truth can hide, and how costly it is when no one insists on finding it. The last echo of the case did not arrive with sirens or headlines, but with silence, the kind that settles only after a storm has passed and left the landscape altered in ways that are subtle at first, almost polite, until you realize nothing will ever sit exactly the same again. By the time the file was officially archived, the paper itself had begun to yellow at the edges, ink fading just enough to suggest time's quiet insistence, yet every name inside it still carried weight, still pressed against the present like a fingerprint that refused to lift. Investigators signed off one by one, not with relief, but with a kind of guarded resignation, the understanding that closed was a procedural word, not a moral one. In Ohio, 1999 never fully ended. It lingered in diner conversations that trailed off mid-sentence, in the way people glanced twice at abandoned cars on the shoulder, in the uneasy pause that followed whenever someone mentioned a missing persons case from another state, another decade, another family standing at the same terrible threshold. The traffic stop that had unraveled everything was now taught in academies across the country, dissected frame by frame, radio transmission by radio transmission, a masterclass in routine vigilance, but also a cautionary tale. Instructors emphasized how easily it could have gone the other way, how one distraction, one shortcut, one assumption might have allowed the suspect to disappear back into the dark, taking the truth with him. Recruits listened closely. Veterans listened harder. Because they recognized themselves in the what-ifs. The cold case designation remained attached to the file, a bureaucratic artifact that no one bothered to remove. Some argued it no longer belonged there. Others insisted it stay, a reminder that resolution does not erase origin, that even answers can come too late to warm the living. Emily Carter's disappearance continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. A law bearing her name was proposed, debated, rewritten, and eventually passed, requiring periodic reviews of long-term missing persons cases that showed specific behavioral patterns. It wasn't perfect. It didn't save everyone, but it saved someone. And for those who understood loss, that was enough. Her story entered the bloodstream of the culture quietly. A line in a podcast, a chapter in a book, a reference in a documentary that lingered just a second longer than the others. Viewers and listeners felt the weight without always knowing why, drawn to the unresolved gravity of a young woman who left her apartment one night and stepped into a mystery that would outlive the man responsible for it. The community changed in ways that were almost imperceptible unless you had been there before. Streetlights were replaced. Bus routes adjusted. Volunteer search groups formalized, trained, equipped. There was a collective refusal now to accept disappearance as inevitability. Still, at night, the questions returned. Investigators who had worked the case dreamed of details they couldn't prove. Faces that blurred at the edges. Timelines that almost aligned. Some woke convinced there was one last connection they had missed, one last door they hadn't opened. They would sit up in the dark, replaying it all, then slowly accept what daylight always confirmed. There would be no more answers. The suspect had taken them with him, locked behind a silence that could not be interrogated, bargained with, or undone. And yet, the legacy of the case refused to be purely tragic, because it had exposed a truth that cut deeper than any single crime, that monsters rarely announce themselves, that they move through systems and routines and blind spots, sustained not by brilliance, but by neglect, by the human tendency to stop looking once something becomes familiar. That realization stayed. Years from now, another officer would pull over another car on another empty road, guided by training shaped indirectly by Ohio, by 1999, by a cold case that taught an entire profession how close indifference can come to disaster. That officer would ask one more question, run one more check, notice one detail that didn't quite fit, and somewhere, a life would continue because of it. That was the final truth of the case. Not the arrest, not the revelations, but the quiet recalibration of attention. The understanding that justice is not a single act, but a posture, a willingness to remain alert in moments that feel mundane, to treat every routine encounter as potentially consequential, to resist the seductive ease of assumption. The rail spur still lay where it always had, steel cutting through the landscape, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its history. Trains passed. Seasons changed. The world kept moving. But the ground remembered. So did the people. The Ohio 1999 cold case was marked closed in the system, its status updated, its box filed away, yet its influence remained active, circulating through policy, through memory, through the instincts of those who had learned its lessons the hard way. In the end, there was no final image to linger on. No villain led away in cuffs. No triumphant resolution. Just a long, steady fade into awareness. A reminder whispered rather than shouted, that the most dangerous crimes are often hidden in plain sight, that the smallest moments can carry the heaviest consequences, and that sometimes the difference between a mystery that lasts forever and a truth that finally surfaces is nothing more than a single pause on a dark road, a routine stop, and someone who refuses to look away. Long after the case slipped from public conversation, long after the last article was archived and the final documentary rerun, its presence could still be felt in ways that defied measurement, like a pressure change before a storm, subtle but unmistakable to those who had learned to recognize it. The database never truly slept. Somewhere in a windowless room, servers hummed, holding fragments of lives reduced to entries and timestamps, names cross-referenced against other names, patterns waiting patiently for the day someone noticed them. Every so often, a system update would flag an anomaly tied back to Ohio, 1999, a data echo of a night that refused to remain in the past. Analysts would pause, review, then move on, but the pause mattered. It always did. A new generation of investigators came up hearing the story secondhand, stripped of its immediacy, but not its weight. They were told about the routine traffic stop the way sailors talk about reefs just beneath the surface, not to glorify it, but to warn. This is where complacency breaks ships. This is where certainty drowns truth. Listen longer. Look twice. Trust the detail that makes you uncomfortable. In training rooms, the word cold case stopped sounding like an ending and started sounding like a challenge. Families from other jurisdictions reached out to Ohio quietly, cautiously, asking not for miracles, but for process. How did you keep the case alive? How did you survive the years when nothing moved? The answers were never clean. Persistence, yes. Luck, undeniably. And grief, always present, shaping decisions even when no one wanted to admit it. Emily Carter's name appeared again, this time in a footnote of a federal grant proposal, cited as precedent. It was a strange afterlife, to be remembered not by face or voice but by policy language, by clauses and compliance measures, by the acknowledgement that someone had once been overlooked and should not be again. It was not justice, but it was influence, and influence has a way of traveling farther than truth alone. On certain nights, officers patrolling empty stretches of highway felt it, that flicker of awareness when the road opens wide and time seems to slow, when the mind wanders just enough to be dangerous. Some shook it off. Others leaned into it, adjusted posture, sharpened focus. Those were the ones who remembered the story, even if they couldn't recall the year. The suspect's shadow diminished with time, his identity dissolving into a cautionary abstraction, a reminder rather than a presence. He was no longer discussed in detail. There was no need. His relevance lay not in who he was, but in how easily he had passed unnoticed for so long. In that way, he became less a figure and more a warning sign, posted too late but read carefully by those who came after. The rail spur weathered another decade. Rust crept along the steel. Weeds pushed through gravel. The plaque dulled, words still legible but softened by exposure. No one maintained it officially. It didn't need to be pristine. Its power came from endurance, from remaining when everything else tried to move on. Occasionally, a journalist would revisit the case, hoping to find a new angle, a hidden twist, something left unsaid. They rarely did. What they found instead was fatigue mixed with resolve, a community unwilling to perform its trauma again for the sake of novelty. The story had already given what it could. And yet, the unanswered questions lingered, not as accusations, but as reminders of scale. How many moments like that traffic stop had already passed without consequence? How many would come next? The case didn't answer those questions. It sharpened them. In quiet moments, when the world narrowed to the sound of tires on asphalt and the glow of dashboard lights, the lesson surfaced again, that evil does not require chaos to thrive, only routine left unquestioned. That truth is often discovered not through brilliance, but through patience. And that vigilance, sustained over time, can become a form of mercy. The Ohio 1999 cold case had crossed a threshold few ever do. It had moved from tragedy into instruction, from loss into legacy. Not cleanly, not comfortably, but permanently. Somewhere another file waited, another name, another night suspended between ordinary and irreversible. When that moment came, when attention wavered and choice pressed close, the echo of this case would be there, quiet but insistent. A memory embedded in process. A warning etched into habit. A reminder that even the coldest cases still radiate heat, long after the headlines fade, long after the road goes dark, asking the same silent question of anyone willing to listen. Are you paying attention now? Time did what it always does. It stretched the distance between events until memory began to feel like a rumor, something half-heard and reshaped by repetition, yet the core of the case resisted erosion, holding its shape in the collective subconscious of those who had brushed against it. The file number still existed, buried deep in the system, rarely accessed, but never deleted. On paper, it was inert. In practice, it functioned like a dormant fault line, quiet, stable, until pressure elsewhere caused it to be referenced again, not because it promised answers, but because it had already taught too many lessons to be forgotten. There were nights when former investigators drove familiar roads without realizing why they felt uneasy, a tightening in the chest when headlights cut across empty fields, when the radio crackled and fell silent. They no longer worked the case. Some hadn't worn a badge in years. But the instincts shaped by Ohio, by 1999, remained intact, woven into muscle memory, surfacing when least expected. They had learned that danger does not announce itself with drama. It whispers. In classrooms and briefing rooms far from the original jurisdiction, instructors spoke about pattern blindness, about how long-term offenders survive by exploiting human fatigue, by waiting for attention to drift. The case was never presented as an anomaly. It was framed as a mirror. This is what happens when routine becomes invisible. This is how silence compounds. Students listened. Some nodded. A few understood. Those few would carry it forward. Emily Carter's story continued to surface in fragments. A quote attributed to her in a community newsletter. A scholarship awarded in her name to a student studying criminal justice, chosen not for grades, but for persistence. Each mention was small, almost modest, but together they formed a counterweight to the years she had been reduced to a photograph on a flyer. Her absence had become a presence. In the town where it began, the old apartment building changed tenants, paint colors, management. No one advertised its history. There was no plaque.
No marquer.
Yet residents sometimes reported an unshakable feeling that the walls held something unspoken, that certain hours of the night felt heavier than others. It was dismissed as imagination. It always was. But places remember. The suspect's story faded almost entirely, stripped of detail until only a cautionary outline remained. No one debated his motives anymore. No one searched for hidden meaning in his past. The community had learned that understanding him offered diminishing returns. Attention was better spent elsewhere. On prevention. On awareness. On refusing to accept disappearance as a footnote. A decade after the case was marked closed, a minor policy review cited it again, briefly, almost apologetically, as justification for extending funding to rural cold case initiatives. The reference was clinical, detached, but the effect was real. More cases reopened. More families contacted. More lights switched back on in rooms that had gone dark too early. Some of those cases went nowhere. Some went somewhere unexpected. That was enough. The rail spur endured another winter. Snow filled the gaps between ties. Wind scoured the metal clean. The plaque remained, worn but upright, its presence neither mournful nor triumphant. Just factual. This happened here. Remember. Occasionally, someone would stand there alone, not connected to the case by blood or badge, drawn by something they couldn't name. They would stay a moment, then leave, carrying a quiet resolve they might not recognize until much later. That was how the case continued to work. Indirectly. Unannounced. In moments when attention sharpened instead of dulled. In decisions to double-check, to wait, to ask one more question. The Ohio 1999 cold case had stopped being about a single night, a single victim, a single suspect. It had become an orientation point, a reminder embedded in practice rather than memory, shaping behavior without demanding acknowledgement. And perhaps that was its final form. Not a story retold endlessly, but a pressure applied gently, persistently, guiding hands away from complacency, steering eyes back to what others might miss. The road where it began still stretched into darkness each night, empty, ordinary, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. And somewhere along it, the lesson remained. Unmarked. Unspoken. Waiting. Eventually, the case stopped announcing itself altogether. It no longer surfaced in conferences or memos. It wasn't cited in training slides or policy debates. Its name drifted into the background, replaced by newer references, fresher tragedies, more recent failures. On the surface, it appeared to have finally done what time does best: disappear. But underneath that quiet, it continued to function the way pressure does underground, unseen yet influential, shaping decisions without asking for recognition. Investigators who had never heard of Ohio 1999 still benefited from it. They inherited protocols refined by its mistakes, instincts sharpened by its blind spots, habits formed in response to a case they would never study directly. When they hesitated instead of rushing, when they questioned instead of assuming, they were responding to an echo they didn't know existed. That was the strange mercy of the case. It no longer needed to be remembered to matter. In the Carter household, time moved differently. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived and departed with practiced restraint. Emily's room was eventually repurposed, but nothing was thrown away. Objects migrated into boxes, boxes into closets, closets into silence. Her parents learned to live with two timelines running in parallel, the one where life continued and the one where it stopped. They rarely visited the rail spur anymore. Not because it hurt less, but because it hurt differently. Grief had matured into something quieter, heavier, less dramatic but more persistent. It didn't spike. It settled. And in that settled grief, they found a kind of resolve. They spoke to fewer reporters. They attended fewer panels. When they did speak, it wasn't to retell the story. but to correct it. To remind people that their daughter was not a symbol, not a lesson, not a cautionary tale. She was a person who had plans, preferences, flaws, impatience. Someone who existed beyond the moment she vanished. That distinction mattered. In the wider world, missing persons posters continued to appear and fade. Faces replaced by newer faces. Names cycling through attention spans too short to hold them. Most cases never reached the threshold Ohio had crossed. Most ended without answers, without headlines, without even a footnote. The difference was not effort. It was timing. It was luck. It was someone paying attention at the right moment. That truth sat uneasily with people who wanted justice to be predictable, to follow rules, to reward persistence every time. The case had taught otherwise. It had shown that sometimes resolution arrives sideways through coincidence, through routine, through a decision that feels insignificant until it isn't. On certain nights, when the roads were empty and the patrol cars few, officers found themselves slowing without knowing why, scanning longer, listening harder. They would later struggle to explain the instinct. They might call it experience, training, a gut feeling. They wouldn't call it Ohio, but it was there. The suspect's name disappeared almost entirely from records available to the public. Redactions multiplied. References softened. This wasn't mercy. It was intentional erasure. The community had decided, quietly and collectively, that he did not deserve permanence. The victims did. That choice reshaped memory. In libraries and archives, the case file gathered dust, but it was not inert. Researchers still requested it occasionally, not to sensationalize, but to understand failure. How it accumulates, how it hides, how it convinces people that tomorrow will be the day they finally act. Those researchers rarely left with answers. They left with discomfort. And discomfort, when respected, has a way of changing behavior. The rail spur remained exactly as it was. No ceremony marked anniversaries anymore. No flowers appeared, just weather, passing trains, and the slow reclamation of metal by time. It had become something closer to a scar than a monument, visible only if you knew where to look. That felt appropriate, because the case itself had become a scar. Not open, not bleeding, but present. A reminder that healing does not erase damage, it simply teaches the body how to move without reopening the wound. As the years accumulated, as the world layered new crises over old ones, the Ohio 1999 cold case settled fully into its final state. Not resolved, not forgotten, integrated, a silent influence, a recalibrated instinct, a story no longer told aloud, but still shaping the way people notice the dark, the ordinary, the moments that seem harmless until they aren't. And somewhere on a road that looks like every other road, under a sky that offers no warning, that influence waits. Patient, unassuming, ready for the next moment when attention makes all the difference. At some point, the case stopped belonging to anyone in particular. It no longer belonged to the investigators who chased it, or the journalists who documented it, or even the family who carried its deepest cost. It slipped into a wider, colder space, the realm of collective responsibility, where stories stop being personal and start becoming structural. That transition was subtle, almost imperceptible. It showed up in budget meetings where someone argued, just briefly, for keeping a position funded. In policy drafts where a line about follow-ups was written more carefully than before. In a dispatcher's voice lingering half a second longer on a call that didn't quite make sense. No one mentioned Ohio. No one said 1999. They didn't have to. The instincts were already there. In communities far removed from the original case, families of the missing began to notice a shift they couldn't quite name. Calls were returned more consistently. Questions were asked earlier. Silence, while still present, no longer felt absolute. The system hadn't become compassionate, but it had become alert, and for people living in uncertainty, alertness mattered. Some investigators admitted, quietly, that the case had changed how they slept. That certain details followed them home now. That they trusted routine, less than they used to. They had learned that familiarity is not safety, That repetition can be camouflage, and once that lesson takes hold, it doesn't release easily. It rewires perception. Emily Carter's photograph still existed online, replicated across archives and databases, its resolution degrading with each re-upload, yet her eyes remained sharp, challenging, present. People who encountered it years later felt an unexpected pull, a sense that this was not just another face in a long list. They didn't always know why. They didn't need to. Her name had crossed a threshold. It no longer demanded attention. It commanded it. The town itself moved on in the way towns always do. New businesses, new families, new routines layered over old ones. Children grew up unaware of what had happened on their streets decades earlier. That ignorance wasn't failure. It was survival. Communities cannot remain frozen forever. But the infrastructure remembered. Street lighting grids were redesigned. Patrol routes adjusted. Data sharing agreements that once stalled now moved faster, greased by a shared understanding that delay has a cost. These were not dramatic changes. They were incremental. And incremental change is the kind that lasts. The suspect's absence grew absolute. He had become irrelevant, a shape without detail, a caution stripped of narrative. This was intentional. The community had learned that obsession is a form of oxygen, and it refused to provide it. The harm mattered. The cause did not. That distinction took years to learn. In rare moments, when a new cold case surfaced with eerily familiar patterns, someone would mention Ohio in passing, not as proof, but as possibility. As a reminder that resolution sometimes arrives from angles no one is watching. Those moments were quiet, professional, stripped of drama. Effective. The rail spur endured another cycle of seasons. Ice cracked along the metal. Heat warped the air above it. The plaque darkened further, its edges softened, the words still legible, but no longer sharp. It didn't need to be read often.
It only needed to exist.
Because existence is memory's most durable form. As time stretched on, the case's final lesson settled fully into place, less a conclusion than a posture. That vigilance is not paranoia. That skepticism is not cynicism. That attention, sustained without spectacle, can alter outcomes in ways no one ever celebrates. The Ohio 1999 cold case had completed its transformation. From tragedy to warning to habit. And habits, once formed, are difficult to break. Somewhere, on some road, another routine moment waited. Another decision balanced between assumption and inquiry. Another chance for history to repeat itself or not. The difference would not be obvious. It never is. But the influence would be there, quiet and patient, guiding a hand, slowing a step, sharpening a glance, the unseen inheritance of a case that refused to stay buried, even after it stopped being spoken aloud. And that inheritance, passed forward without ceremony, was the closest thing to justice the story would ever have.